everyone. I am Jessica, the Program Manager for Greensboro Bound. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Future of Democracy Part 1, Counting the Vote. Tonight we'll be talking with ERIN GEIGER SMITH and Gilda Daniels to tell you a little bit about our guests. Gilda is an associate professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law and the director of litigation at the National Office of the Multiracial Civil Rights Organization Advancement Project. She is a nationally recognized voting rights and election law expert and author of Uncounted, the Crisis of Voter Suppression in America, which examines the phenomenon of disenfranchisement through the lens of history, race, law, and the democratic process. Our other guest is ERIN GEIGER SMITH. ERIN, as a journalist, has written for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and once worked for Business Insider and Reuters covering legal news. ERIN's latest project is authoring Thank You for Voting. Sorry about that. Thank You for Voting, the Maddening, Enlightening, Inspiring Truth About Voting in America, which started as a side project researching a nonfiction work for best-selling author Ann Patchett. As the project evolved and with Patchett's blessing, ERIN took on the book as her own. I'll also add, for those of you with curious, civic-minded kids at home, Thank You for Voting also comes in an easier-to-digest young reader's edition. And for those of you here in Greensboro, you can purchase these titles and many, many others from our independent bookseller partner, Scuppernong Books. Our host for the evening is Gary Kenton, founding member of Democracy Greensboro, a grassroots organization who advocate for innovative approaches in municipal government and seek justice for all in civil, criminal, economic, government, environmental, and social justice matters. Thank you all to our guests for joining us for this conversation, and a special thank you to the League of Women Voters of the Piedmont Triad for helping to promote this event. For our audience, we will take audience questions a little later on this evening. When the time comes, Gary will let you know, and then you can submit your questions directly to Gary via the chat function. Once again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Take it away, Gary.
Thank you, Jessica. And the reason I'm here is because I am on the board of directors of the League of Women Voters of the Piedmont Triad. And well, first I want to say, these two women are citizen scholars. They are public intellectuals. I think that is, we need more of them. We need more people like that. So thank you for doing what you do and writing your books. But anyway, the League of Women Voters, like the 19th Amendment, which I've been corrected. I've said gave women the right to vote, but a lot of women pointed out at the time they had the right to vote. It just had to be recognized and codified. But anyway, that happened in 1920. And that same year was the birth of the League of Women Voters. For those who don't know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, and it does not ever endorse any political party or candidates, but it is very thoroughly a political organization. It does research on issues and takes positions on those issues and advocates on those issues. So a lot of people don't quite understand being nonpartisan and being totally politically active at the same time. All right, so thank you for your books. I guess what I'd like to start, I see two historical narratives here. I always try to talk to my students about historical narratives. One is this constant drive to prevent Black people from voting and other minority groups. The other is this movement to increase the franchise, that especially since the 1960s, there was pretty consistent motion to allow more people to vote and make it easier to vote. So I guess I wanted the two of you and start, I guess, with you, Gilda, if that's okay, is to these two different narratives, and right now they both seem to be playing out in real time. Do you see one? Well, I've said enough. Go ahead.
Thank you, Greensboro Bound, for having me tonight, and thank you, Gary, for the question. So when we talk about historical narratives, I think it is very important that we recognize the role that history and the history of voter suppression has played in our democratic process. And in my book, I talk about what I have identified as cycles of voter suppression, that there are cycles, or there are periods of progress that are met almost immediately, or certainly in a short time period of regress, of regressive laws that in many instances, and certainly historically, have diminished, in some instances, eliminated gains that have been made. I start with the founding of the country, where we have this paradoxical democracy, where on the one hand we say that all men are created equal, and at the same time we designate enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person, right? And so it immediately setting up this second-class citizenship in regards to and also demonstrates how we value the remnants of citizenship. And it takes about 100 years from the all men are created equal to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? And so you saw with the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, the 14th Amendment said equal protection under the laws, and then the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. And Black men voted, Black men registered, Black men voted in large numbers, and were able to literally change the complexion of the electorate in electing members to the United States House of Representatives, as well as the United States Senate, and state and local governments. So, like, for example, in 1890, you had 2 African-American men representing the state of Mississippi in the United States Senate. Okay, I pause for effect, because we have not had 2 African Americans elected to the United States Senate from the South since 1890. We only have 3 African Americans in the United States Senate today: Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Tim Scott from South Carolina. Right? And so, and so you go from that. You have that period of enfranchisement and activity and participation. And so and the states had to, those Confederate states had to adopt the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments before they could return to the Union. So what they did in returning to the Union, they adopted poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, felon disenfranchisement, and also engaged in economic terror. People could, would lose their land as well as lose their lives. There are a number of massacres that are associated with, certainly with the right to vote and people trying to exercise the franchise, that occurred in the early 1900s. So from 1890 to the early 1900s, and I'm talking 1901, 1906, certainly when they were having these constitutional conventions, what we saw was almost the complete elimination of Black men from the voting rolls in places like Alabama, where there were approximately 140,000 Black men who were registered in the 1890s. After the passage of these literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other measures, in 1906, there were 46 Black men on the voter rolls. And that's exemplary of what was happening certainly across the South. And from the 1900s to 1965, you saw what Dr. King called all types of conniving methods that were being used to ensure that Black and brown people could not register and could not actually participate in the voting process. So, and it's about 100 years from the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so we have these, what I've identified as these 100-year cycles. We're presently 55 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we are seeing suppressive measures once again, which I know we'll get into, but certainly when we're looking at history, certainly the history has demonstrated that certainly these measures were intended, and they said so during the constitutional conventions in the early 1900s. The intention was to remove Black and brown people from the voter rolls. And what we're seeing now is certainly that there are legislatures that are making it much harder for people to vote, and the impact is certainly upon Black and brown voters as well as young voters and elderly voters.
All right. Erin, do you wish to jump in on that, or?
I think I'm happy to sort of follow that.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's, you know, one of the reasons that I wanted to go through history in my book, which tries to look at history and then what's happening now, and then explain topics that the most educated voters even find confusing, like gerrymandering and the Electoral College. But I wanted to start with history to show how we as Americans have this great ideal of voting, and it's one of our most important rights. But from the very beginning, people were figuring out how to constrict that right. And anytime there was progress made, immediately people in back rooms tried to take that progress away. And it was specifically done in all the ways that that Gilda said. You know, you look at the period of Reconstruction and all the progress that was made during that time that was immediately chipped away of by Jim Crow laws for decades. So I think understanding that history and really accepting that history more will help us respect people's right to vote better and think harder about new voting laws and what they do. So, I mean, part of the reason to really understand the history is so when we see the way vote by mail is being developed right now in such a quick pace, to really think, what are these rules that are being made? What are they really trying to stop? What are they say they're trying to stop, but what are they really trying to do? And I think understanding our history and how it was so often those one step forward, two steps back, will get us to a much better and much better understood place.
We can hope. I don't know if people follow the news today, but the president engaged a debate about what is our history, and he cited Howard Zinn and others of having perpetrated a false history that Americans and young children are being taught what the president considers a false history of the United States, and he's establishing a commission that will revamp the history that you're all talking about. But anyway,
Gary, the interesting thing about the meeting today, and I just saw a few accounts of, is that there are no people of color in that meeting.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
So if the history that you want to recount is white supremacist history, then don't include other people. So it certainly it excludes certainly the contributions of many people.
Right.
And it just pushes us back in any hope to better understand progress and make a more inclusive voting system. Right. So it is extremely unfortunate to, at a time when we're dealing with such serious issues, have to spend a lot of time pushing back on false narratives. Is just a problem in this entire election cycle.
Yeah. Let me just say, early in Gilda's book, she does a very nice thing, a lot of nice things, but there's a chart that you have that shows the historical tactics of voter suppression, and then next to it, some very similar, but also some current methods. I thought that was great to provide. Maybe I'm selling our audience short, but of all some of them are self-explanatory, but grandfather clauses, would you mind telling people what that was? Because that was, they're all pernicious, but that one was, eliminated many of those thousands of people that you mentioned who were voting, and then all of a sudden they couldn't.
Right, so the grandfather clause is one of those disenfranchising mechanisms that was passed certainly during those constitutional conventions in the early 1900s, which essentially said that if your grandfather was able to vote prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, then you could vote, right? So that essentially eliminated every, African-American, and that at that time, certainly African-American men who were, who had registered after the passage of the 15th Amendment.
Right. So it's good for us people when you use that phrase, I was grandfathered in. It's good for people to know that history. All right. I guess, I thought it might be good to, come up to the current situation and for have you describe, either one of you, Shelby versus Holder. That, I mean, defines the environment for voting that we're in today. And I'm guessing some people may not know exactly what that Supreme Court decision was. You want to, either one of you, I don't know.
I was only a law student and not a law professor, so I am not going to, I'm going to let the professor take I can certainly give the layman's, but Gilda, you
she'll add
go
on.
forth with the Shelby.
So it's important to understand the importance of the Voting Rights Act. I think in that, the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson called it monumental. Even Ronald Reagan called it a crown jewel, said that it was a crown jewel. And so the Voting Rights Act had two primary provisions. One is Section 2, which is a national prohibition against discrimination in voting. And there is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required what was considered covered jurisdictions, which was essentially all or parts of 11 states, primarily in the South, to submit any voting changes to either the United States Attorney General or the DC District Court. I was a deputy chief in the Civil Rights Division voting section where those submissions would come. So any change that the jurisdictions made, like legislation that they passed, bills that were passed that affected the right to vote, had to first be what was called pre-cleared by the Attorney General before they could be implemented. And that could be a polling place, moving a polling place across the street, removing people from the voter rolls, congressional redistricting. On average, the department would receive about 5,000 submissions that equated to about 14,000 changes, right? And so that's in 1 year. So the Voting Rights Act made that requirement on the jurisdictions, and it did a number of other things, like removing barriers to registration, even had federal employees to go to the South and actually register people to vote, right? Because the local registrars had refused to do so for so long, right? That the Voting Rights Act required that, and the Voting Rights Act also required federal observers, where federal employees would observe certainly contentious elections. Section 5 is a temporary provision, so it had to be reauthorized periodically. It was reauthorized during the Reagan administration and during both Bush administrations, George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush. And last time it was reauthorized was in 2006. There's a case, the case of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 found that the Supreme Court found that the provision, Section 5 provision that required these jurisdictions to get approval before they could implement any voting changes was that it was unconstitutional, essentially. So it gutted is the word that you see everywhere. It gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, so that now what's happening is these jurisdictions are making changes without ever having them vetted by anyone, federal, state, or otherwise. As I mentioned, they were talking about 14,000 changes. So when you read the news about polling place closures, those in the past, you would not have read about that until after it had been approved, so that the Justice Department would have determined that those closures did not put Black and brown voters in a worse position or retrogress. So without that, we lack notice. So it provided notice certainly to the communities that the changes were going to happen. And it also served as a deterrent, because jurisdictions knew that the Department of Justice or the district court was looking or would review these changes. There were certain things that they just wouldn't submit. But we saw that once the Supreme Court issued its opinion in Shelby County versus Holder, states immediately started implementing changes that had been considered discriminatory. We certainly saw that in Texas with its restrictive voter ID, and North Carolina with its omnibus changes.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say North Carolina was one of the first states. It within days of the Shelby Holder decision, the wheels were working to bring back some of those the greatest hits of voter suppression. I also, if you don't mind, I'll also mention, I know both of you in your book cited Ari Berman, who's been writing about voting for many years. He describes Johnson's move for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and as soon as he finished, he said, well, that's it. The Democrats have probably lost the South for the next decade. And he was off by a couple of decades. It's been more like 3 decades, but he was exactly right. So Johnson understood how monumental these 2 pieces of legislation were, but that it wasn't the last word on voting. I guess, I'm sorry, thank you, Gilda, for going back and talking about those pieces of legislation when I asked about Shelby. So I apologize, my chronology may be a little mixed up here because I wanted to get to voter fraud. In other words, that now is the rationale, broad rationale being used for all the voter suppression methods that we're seeing now. So I know, and both of you address this. So I guess, Erin, would could you describe what the reality of voter fraud and the argument?
I can do that very quickly, which is that voter fraud does not exist on any level that impacts elections. It happens, but in such very small numbers. If you get caught doing it, you get in big trouble, as I would say to my 6-year-old. There are deterrents, especially since it's the talk so much with mail-in voting. It's simply really hard to do, and people don't do it. The fact that we have to spend so much time discussing voter fraud is just so frustrating because it is nothing but a distraction. It just does not exist in any numbers that matter even. Of course, there is not a single person who cares about voting who wants someone to vote when they shouldn't. And if they do, they should get caught. But it is just the discussion of voter fraud. I have had more discussions about voter fraud since my book came out on June 23rd than cases of voter fraud that have happened in the millions and millions and millions of ballots cast. And what I have tried to do as I discuss this as a reporter and a member of the media is try to really drive home that anytime we talk about voter fraud, not only do you need to push back and note that these claims just don't have value or merit, but to turn around and comfort people in a way that if you follow the steps, your vote is going to count. And that shouldn't be something that we have to do, but it's something that's really important to follow on. My overarching feeling about it is we have to keep talking about it to help people understand that it doesn't exist, but it takes so much away from the chance to really educate people on what the issues they might actually face are. But when you have politicians and the Attorney General bringing it up so regularly, there's nothing you can do but push back on it. The other thing that I find is difficult in this discussion is it's become a partisan discussion because it is often the Republican Party who's using it as a reason to pass these laws, but the facts aren't partisan. The fact is it doesn't exist. And so it's just, I said 9 times there, voter fraud is not a reason to create any of these laws, and I think all we can do is keep saying it. But it's just really unfortunate that we have to discuss something that's of such minimal impact when we have true issues that are happening.
Yeah.
That's my voter fraud spiel. I wish we didn't have to talk about it so much. It's just, it is not, it's sort of a thing to kind of talk about it with is voter ID, because it is certainly used as a reason to have voter ID. And this study that looked at hundreds of thousands of voters, and their basic takeaway was voter ID doesn't stop voter fraud, in part because there's not enough voter fraud to stop. I mean, it's
Right.
So you're using, you're creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist and doesn't solve the non-existent problem.
All right. I'll just say my experience speaking on behalf of the League out in the community, and especially out in more rural areas, is exactly the same as yours. No matter what I was emphasizing, voter fraud was by far the one issue they wanted to talk about. So the narrative is very powerful. And the first time I was in that situation, I made a mistake. I dismissed it and said, it doesn't exist. You know, and I lost the crowd. I lost the audience at that moment. I learned to at least respect the fact that they really believed it. They saw this as a threat, you know. But so I guess, Erin, let's talk about voter ID for a second, because again, I've spoken to a lot of people who find that a very reasonable thing. They have to show their IDs for all kinds of things in their lives. Maybe at the supermarket to cash a check or something. Would you address?
Sure. Yeah, I think voter ID is one of those things that sounds extremely reasonable. You need an ID to do so many things. You know, if you live in a large city, you often need an ID to get a photo ID. If you're visiting an office building, to pick up your FedEx package, all of those things. So it sounds reasonable, but the laws are all over the place for what counts as your voter ID. And so in certain places, your student ID doesn't count. Well, that is a direct focus to make it a little harder for young people to vote. So it does, you know, it's one of those things where the numbers aren't, you know, 100 million people, but if we want everybody to vote, every single one of those numbers matters. And, you know, 3 or 4% of the population, and I know Gilda has a big breakdown of numbers in her book. When you talk about the percentage of people who are impacted, that it is much more often Black and brown people and elderly people and young people. It's just, you have to think, well, do we want to leave those votes on the table, prevent those people from voting, again, to solve a problem that doesn't exist? So I think when you're talking raw numbers, sometimes it gets difficult to convince someone of the importance. But if you're a person who believes that everybody should be able to vote, these laws keep people away who should not be kept away. There's, you know, no other reason other than that they're elderly or that they're a young person without the right ID. So it's just one of those things, again, that when your state passes a law, you need to think hard about who it is that's keeping out, especially because what ID means varies so much from state to state.
I know my mother, towards the end of her life, stopped driving, didn't have her driver's license, and, you know, it became an issue. I mean, she was able to get around it, but I'm just saying it's not, you know, anyway.
Can I add something on that, on the voter ID issue? That, so, you know, Erin is absolutely correct. And what we're talking about, the problem is with restrictive voter ID, right? Okay, yes, you need IDs for all these other things, but when a legislature says you can only have these 3 or 4 pieces of identification, a driver's license, military ID, passport, or in a state like Texas, a hunting license, and they know that there are large groups of voters, of eligible persons who don't have that particular identification, form of identification. Right, and so we have to look at the intent, as Erin is saying, look at the intent of the legislation. So in a place like Texas, where they said at the day that Shelby County, the day the Shelby County decision was issued, they said, okay, we're going to institute this voter ID, which was a restrictive voter ID law. It took a number of years, and there were at least 3 federal district courts that said that that voter ID law was intentionally discriminatory, and found that there were more than 600,000 Black and brown people in Texas who did not have that form or have any of those forms of identification. We're talking about 600,000 people, right? Same thing in North Carolina. North Carolina said, no Shelby County, we don't have any federal oversight. Let's institute a restrictive voter ID, right? And did so knowing that there were large groups of eligible persons who would not have those forms of identification, and the state did not certainly was not trying to help them get those forms of identification or the underlying documents. We've certainly had a number of cases on voter ID that says that the state does have to provide those identifications, free identifications for people who don't need a driver's license. In Georgia, it was 25% of African Americans didn't own a car, yet the legislation said you had to have a driver's license in order to cast a ballot. So I think, so when we look at the intent of these bills, and particularly the voter ID, and this idea that, everybody has an ID, everybody does not have an identification. I just told you in Texas, there were 600,000 people. That's 600,000 votes. And so those are all the things that need to be considered. And so, when people talk about how commonplace voter ID is, yes, it is commonplace to have certain types of ID, but that's what you have states that have expanded the list to include things like a piece of mail to identify who you are. So yes, if we can have verification of our identity, but we don't need to limit it to 2 or 3 pieces of 2 or 3 different forms of identity.
Right. Well, you both raise another issue. We're talking about the states, and Gilda, you're probably well equipped to address this because of the jobs you've had. Why is it that we have this patchwork system where every state has their own rules for voting? Seems like if there was, I'm not saying there should be only one set of rules for everybody, but there should be a baseline, basic set of rules that apply across the board, and then states can vary somewhat. Why is it that this one cherished right that we have of voting has not, the federal government says, nah, the states will do it?
It's in the Constitution, and Erin can talk about this as well, because it's in the Constitution, right? That the qualifications of electors is in the Constitution. That is given to the states to determine what are the qualifications that are needed in order to cast a ballot in the state, right? And so that can be how long you have to be a resident before you can register. They can't now. The states can't do things like say that you have to be 21, right? We do have constitutional amendments that say what you can't do, like you can't discriminate based on race. You can't deny a woman the right to vote because of her gender. You can't say someone over 18 or over can't vote. So you're not supposed to have a poll tax. That's a whole nother argument. So and we have more constitutional amendments on the right to vote than any other right. But there is also this argument that we need an explicit right to vote in the Constitution, and maybe that would cut down on some of the shenanigans that we're seeing. If there was a constitutional amendment that said, thou dost have the right to vote.
Right.
It's just like you have the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. You have the right to vote. Right, as opposed to don't discriminate here, don't discriminate there. So there is that debate that's going around. But states, the bottom line is that the Constitution gives states the ability to determine certain parameters around how people access the right to vote.
And I think that's something that, because we live in our own states and deal with our own voting laws, that people just don't have reason really to appreciate how different it all is. I think this whole discussion of vote by mail and everybody all of a sudden having to think, okay, what specifically are my rules? And then you hear, wait a minute, Utah's getting all their ballots. Perhaps the only good thing about this constant ongoing discussion is that I think it's made people aware of that some states have better voting laws than others, and that it would probably be, less confusing for everyone if we did a little better on that. But the other thing that I sort of hope to point out in the book is the voting laws of other states obviously affect you, because who's elected to Congress and to the Senate and as president affect every American. So I wish we could do a better job of really highlighting the differences between states, because it's another thing that I think would help people understand a little better that we've got a long way to go to make our system really equal to everyone. Even with those who have been convicted of felonies, the restoration of their rights, and that discussion is going on. Just realizing that certain people can vote in certain states that can't in others. And I think that's just a very unusual part of having 50 different sets of voting laws.
Right.
And there has been congressional legislation like the National Voter Registration Act. That's why we get to register and vote at the DMV, or the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? So the Congress has taken best practices from various states and said, hey, everybody needs to do this, right? To avoid using its power to say this is what needs to happen across the country. And there is legislation, HR 1, HR 4, that the House passed more than 100 days ago, that's been on the desk of Mitch McConnell, that would do certain things that would address some of this crazy quilt of laws that we see across the country.
Right. And it keeps one of the things that HR 1 suggested was something that sounds pretty simple, which is a standard early voting period. Things like that would make it much easier for national organizations like the League of Women Voters and others to really educate the country as a whole. But all of these things really hurt voter turnout and voter registration, because anyone trying to have a big campaign has to send everyone to be sure and look at what your state's rules are. And it creates a barrier to just getting education out full force to people, because it has to be done state by state. And registrations, I think, really take a hit, because you can't just have blanket national education programs.
And I know a lot of people who have moved from one state to another and think they were registered where they used to live, and they think they're registered and find out only when it's too late that they were not. Well, one thing that's been suggested a lot recently that would have, I think, practical impacts and symbolic impacts would be a federal holiday that make Election Day a federally recognized holiday that everyone would have off. Do we think, I'm guessing both of you might be favorable to that idea. The question, I guess, is do we think that's a possibility? And tell me if I'm wrong, that if there's any downside to that.
I'll see. Gilda, how do you feel? I actually am not certain that I think we need one or should have one. And the reason is, to me, because we put so much emphasis on the presidential elections, and I worry that will be the only election holiday, triggering in people that, well, if it's not a holiday, it must not be Election Day. And we have midterms, and we have governor's elections, and we have mayoral elections. I think we have to do everything to make it more convenient for people to vote and give people more options. And then my other more sort of minor concern, not minor, but logistical, is a national holiday means all schools are out. All schools are out means people don't have childcare and have to juggle that more. So I am much more for this movement for companies to give employees time off to vote, or be able to work from home that day, or whatever it is, if we ever go back to if we ever see our offices again. Just kidding. I really hope we do. I want it to be soon. But so that I'm of two minds about it. So
Yeah.
Gilda, what's your take on it?
I'm an all hands on deck. And when it comes to this, it's like, yes, let's have a national holiday.
Let's do it.
Let's have same day voter registration. Let's have automatic voter registration. Let's expand early voting to 30 days. I'm like, that's just, I think we just add that as one additional thing that we offer, that serves as an option for folks to actually exercise the right to vote. I think the more the better.
Right. Well, I guess it could be, let's talk about turnout. That both of you present a lot of pretty distressing statistics about how few Americans vote who have the right to vote and don't. So I guess first, if we could, let's describe the facts of the matter. In other words, I've just sort of said it, but what does our turnout look like? And then we can start talking about why we think that is the case. Erin just spoke, Gilda.
I jumped in first last time. Gilda, do you want this one? Or I can run down the stats and you can do this, however you want to do it.
Turnout, So this is my law professor answer, right? It depends.
Right.
It depends on the election, and we've certainly, and I'm a proponent of voting in every election, right? And we do have this inordinate, focus on presidential elections. We're like, wait a minute, school board is very important. Sheriff, DA, those certainly with the down ballot in state and local elections are very important. So turnout is certainly an issue. So it's a question: why do we have low turnout? Or because certainly, large part of my argument is that we just make it so difficult, and we we have these systems that are actively suppressing the vote. In most places, it's hard. It's an awful comparison, but in many places, most places, it's easier to get a gun than it is to register to vote. To actually go to even after you register, it's what do you have to do or what do you have to bring with you in order to actually cast a ballot, right? Like when do you have to do those things, right? All the rules that we have, and it's we've been saying those rules vary from not only state to state, county to county, and city to city. And I think people are fatigued. I think people are tired. I mean, this is certainly in these times with all the issues. I'm from Louisiana. It's like, how many hurricanes have we had just in the last few weeks, and we're also trying folks are also trying to get out the vote and educate people on how to request a ballot and whether or not you even meet the requirements to request a ballot. It's exhausting. And I think, folk have to be energized in order to go through that process. But I do think certainly in this season that people are recognizing that they have to do a few things. When one is certainly plan their right to vote and kind of we're all wrapping our minds around, okay, we may have to wait in line. So bring a sandwich and a book and an umbrella and a chair, right? Because I think people are dedicated and committed to actually doing what it takes and to cast these ballots and in many ways overcome these suppressive measures that have been put in place. So hopefully we can elect people who will indeed see the value of the vote and work with citizens and work with all people certainly to make it easier to vote and have easier access to the ballot.
I hear what you're saying about obstacles and fatigue, but do you also see, I know Gilda and I teach. Erin's a freelancer. That deserves its own medal. But I do see a bit of a generation gap. When I speak to my students, and I teach at a historically African-American university, where they tend to associate voting with the civil rights generation and this whole other set of things that they don't buy into. And at least what I tell them is, I'm not doubting their analysis of what they see on the world, but I'm telling them to vote anyway. But I get, and Erin it has a lot in her book about trying to make voting cool. But so I guess, well, first of all, do you both see what I see, that there is this, we do have a generational gap about that, the ethic of voting, that sense that.
I mean, from the reporting part of this, where I talked to young people, and I was generally in rooms with engaged young people. So, but even they said that it was very hard for them to make the connection between the issues that they cared about. And these are, I didn't meet anyone who was apathetic about their education or healthcare, or especially for younger generations, climate change or school and gun safety. But if you haven't been taught to vote, it's a unique thing. You don't know how to do it. You don't know, as Gilda pointed out, all of these steps that you have to take. And I really came to see it not as young people don't understand the importance of voting, rather than those of us for whom it has always been pretty easy to vote, and I include myself in that category. I'm from a really small town in Texas. I grew up going to vote with my mom. It took 10 minutes because it was a tiny town, and it was very easy. And so I never saw voting as an obstacle. It was just something that I did, and that's something that's very lucky for me. And so my job is to help other people for whom it hasn't been presented so easily to learn why it's important. So I really wish we could switch the conversation around to why aren't young people voting, to why aren't we helping young people vote? We need to do better in high schools, helping young people pre-register in states where they can. It's another thing. Some states and high schools and some states and cities do it well, and some are terrible at it. And there are so many organizations that are trying to do better, specifically with going to where the voters are, high school and college and all these things. But, I feel like if we're upset about young people voting, there's no one to blame except the older people who didn't teach them how to do it. So I just think we've got to get much better about that, because it simply isn't apathy. But there isn't an 18-year-old alive who likes to go do something for the first time that they're uncertain how to do. And if you don't have friends and family and teachers and colleagues, if you're working, teaching you these steps and helping you plan, you're just not going to do it. And we do have to overcome those hurdles of the politicians that they see often look so different from their own life. And that's both not having enough people of color in elected positions, and also, if you are a 18 and 19-year-old, you're not seeing a lot of young people stand up and argue in the Senate. It feels very far from you. So we just have to do better. We have to do better. The young people aren't going to teach themselves to vote. They're not just going to come upon the idea. We have to present it to them, I think. And it's what, parents need to do it. And then if there's not a parent that's doing it, the slack has to be picked up somewhere, and that's our responsibility.
And I connect certainly, with all the young people in the protests, right? And say, if you're upset about that the killer of Ahmaud Arbery, that the sheriff never arrested him, right? It took months before the sheriff arrested him, or for the district attorney to press charges. In Georgia this year, you have the ability to elect the sheriff and elect the DA, right? And so helping them to see that if you really, you're out protesting about these issues, that you can actually have some power over who these people are, and certainly what they do by voting. And that's, you know, true in other parts of the states, other parts of the country as well. And certainly trying to make them see that, you know, that there are many tools that you can use, hopefully to empower and effectuate change. Protesting is certainly one, but the vote is also a very powerful tool that is, as you are talking about, Gary, underutilized by people who are between 18 and 35, and we certainly have to increase their participation. And we do have to teach them how to register and how to vote and how to navigate all of these rules. But also, you know, if they care enough to be out in them streets,
Right.
more than care enough to actually register and vote.
Yeah. Well, I hear what Erin's saying, and she does a great job in her book about talking about how to make it cool and various efforts. And one of the chat people said, you know, youcanvote.org does a great job oriented towards that 18 to 35 age group. But my reaction to making it cool is, no, make it real. Because the kids I've seen on the campus of A&T State University and others, they're energized. They get to it from the issues that Erin talked about. They're interested in, you know, their student debt. They're interested in gun safety. They're interested in these things. And then they get to, then the voting, they're getting to it for a reason, not just because some old codger like me is telling them that they ought to do it. So I think that's, you know, important. I guess, you know, it's really amazing. This hour is flying by. So I had other questions, but I think I'm seeing some come in, and I'll look at the chats. But let me start with one about voting by mail. In other words, that has become, you know, all these things that we never thought would be controversial are controversial, the post office. But do you, either of you, have any concerns about, you know, because now many more people, especially people who tend to vote Democratic, are signaling their intention to vote by mail. Do either of you see any concerns either with the mechanism of voting by mail or the emphasis on voting by mail?
What I am concerned about is how many people are going to do it for the first time, which just anytime you do something for the first time, it's easy to make mistakes. And we did see in the increased use of vote by mail in some of the primary elections. I'm from a congressional district in New York where it took more than 3 weeks to count the vote, and counting vote by mail takes longer, but the time got a little longer than it perhaps should have for one congressional district. But some of the issues were so many people forgot to sign. There were more ballots thrown out, a very high number than percentage-wise than were expected for forgetting to sign or signature not matching, or ballots being just a few days late. And there were lawsuits and all sorts of issues. But the basic things that we need to think of going into the November election is that people really understand that you have to follow those instructions specifically, make sure you sign, and then track your ballot. You know, a lot of states have it barcoded where you can sort of follow it like UPS package. And if your state isn't up to date with that, call your board of elections and ask how it is you can confirm your ballot was received. So my concern is really stressing to everyone to really follow directions, do it early. If you can use a drop box instead of the USPS, that's just one less ballot that they're dealing with. So I do have concerns about too many ballots being thrown out for signature issues or not following directions, and not having, you know, in a lot of states, you have the opportunity to cure. If you forgot to sign, they're supposed to call you and say, you forgot to sign. But all of these things happening on such a mass level, I that part is what's concerning. Certainly not voter fraud. It's people not doing it on time and kind of the system being sort of more overwhelmed than it should. And so I just think people should give thought to if voting by mail is the right method, or, you know, if you can go vote early in person, do that and be one less mail ballot in the system. And I think it requires those of us in the media to really stress over and over that because we'll have so many more mail-in ballots than usual, because those simply do take longer to count. Some states by law can't start counting and processing till election day, that it's going to take longer to count the ballots. And unless we have, you know, a landslide, an electoral landslide in one way or the other, we're not going to get results in election night in the way that we are accustomed to doing. So it's really another area where we really just, you need to find out what your state is doing and become educated on the process. But I think the system can hold. All of these things just everybody needs to do their job to put the less stress on the system as possible, and do it early.
Right. And I'll just throw out to people, they may not be aware, you can request your absentee ballot, but then you don't have to mail it. As Erin said, you can then drop it off. That's what I've got my absentee ballot, but my intention is to drop it off at an early voting site. So far, the question the league asked the Board of Elections whether they would have a separate thing at the early voting site so that someone could just drop off and not have to wait in line. And so far they've said no, they may not have enough personnel to do that. So again, you may have to plan ahead, but there is that hybrid where you can request your ballot. It doesn't mean you have to mail it.
Right. Please don't cast. Don't. I think there was Trump suggested that you cast your vote by mail ballot and then go vote in person. That is a felony.
Don't do it.
Do
Right.
one or the other.
Right. Okay.
You're right, Gary. You can request it and then decide, oh, I'd rather go early vote or vote in person, and then do that. And then your ballot is still at home, but don't do both.
Right. Okay. One question that came in, Gilda, you mentioned HR 1 earlier, and I guess the question is that legislation specifically to restore some of the elements of the Voting Rights Act that disappeared with Shelby Holder, or is it something else?
HR 4, I think, more particularly addresses restoring the parts of the Voting Rights Act that was lost under the Shelby County versus Holder. And that was passed probably in November or December of 2019. It has been on the desk of Mitch McConnell since that time. So hopefully, that's, and I think that's the piece that they were considering changing the name to name it after John Lewis. It doesn't appear that has actually prompted the Senate to take the matter up either.
Right. Okay. Got one question from one of our most prominent citizens about the effectiveness of citizen poll workers. I know that I've been told that Guilford County is in good shape this way, but there are places where if they don't get enough people to work for the Board of Elections at the polls, that's a rationale for them to close that polling place. I think in Wisconsin, they ended up with a dozen polling places out of 180, something like that. And the excuse they gave was they didn't have enough poll workers. So there's that. But I think the question is about poll watchers. Do you feel like citizen poll watchers might be able to make a difference in the upcoming election?
Well, two things. We certainly need people to apply to become poll workers, because there are people who, elderly people who generally work in that capacity who are not trying to go to the polling places because of COVID-19. So certainly people need to sign up to become poll workers. in regards to poll watchers. There are organizations like 1-866-HOUR VOTE, 1-866-HOUR VOTE, which is election protection, which is a national, it's a national group. It's a number of groups that come together to actually communicate with election officials and also observe polling places. Poll watchers, I know that that's something that I like, True the Vote and some other organizations. I think if you're going to be, I think it's more, I would not suggest that anyone is a vigilante poll watcher. That if you are doing so, that you're doing it with an organization like League of Women Voters, and you know, election protection, or some other organization, or you know, other grassroots or some grassroots organizations, and in your community. I mean, so I think they're going to be, so, and because the poll watchers are essentially going to be outside unless they're with a candidate. So there are going to be more people inside the poll. You know, there'll be enough people inside the poll. I think we need to work with, I think you either work with election protection or with some other organization would be my recommendation.
Okay. I got a question about the requirement in North Carolina to have a witness on the absentee ballot. They wanted to know, you know, what's the rationale for that? Is it?
You know, I think all of those are sort of the same that we've been talking about, to make sure that the person who's filling out the ballot is doing so of their own volition and all of those sorts of things. I don't know what the status of the litigation, of that particular litigation, is in North Carolina, but in almost all the states where that requirement exists, voting rights advocates like the ACLU and others, and often the League of Women Voters in their nonpartisan capacity as well, have been working to have those suspended, at least for this election, when, you know, if you're quarantined, you're not gonna have someone nearby to sign it. So those particular requirements have gotten a lot of attention in this round. And, you know, it's one of those things that it's designed to make sure someone's doing their own voting, but is a true hindrance when we're in the middle of a pandemic. But like I said, I would be extremely surprised if that litigation is not moving through right now in North Carolina, or hasn't had a ruling on it. There's so much vote by mail litigation going on that which state's doing what, it kind of swims through my head at different times, but that's something that definitely voting rights advocates are trying to solve before November. Obviously we're getting extremely close, so hopefully it gets solved soon.
I'll share from a League of Women Voters member, a co-president, let's just say, an important person, reminding people locally that if you want to know more about this and really get into the weeds, the Board of Elections meetings are open. They will have a certain small number of people down at the courthouse in the blue room, but you can also access it online. That's next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and it's open to the public. So if people are listening to this and have additional questions or just want to hear from the experts, I know the League generally has a very favorable opinion of our Board of Elections personnel here, and feel like we're in good hands. But if that is open to the public if people want. And someone also said that they have already gotten their absentee ballot and already submitted it and already gotten told that it was accepted. So
nice work.
All right, I finally got down to the chat message that says you probably need to wrap up. So, all right. So thank you, Jessica, for that. So I think Jessica is going to rejoin us and tell us a little bit about Greensboro Bound, which is the reason we're all here. But before she does, I just want to give my own thanks to ERIN and Gilda. It was a pleasure getting to meet you in this way.
Thanks for doing this. It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everybody so much for being here with us tonight. I know our venue looks a little different than what we thought it would 6 months ago, but we are so incredibly grateful to have the capacity to continue bringing our readers and writers together. And again, just to reiterate, all of Greensboro Bound's programming is 100% free to our community. Whether you are near or far, you are part of Greensboro Bound and our book-loving, writer, reading-loving community. It's you guys here tonight who continue that passion for books, writing, and reading that really make Greensboro Bound and the work that we do possible. There are a couple things that you can do right now to help us continue to serve our community. Number one is stay in touch. If you're not already, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Greensboro Bound. It's the same handle across all the platforms. Second, you can sign up for the mailing list on our website. Excuse me. And in case you're not able to attend any future events, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and you will be notified as soon as we upload any content such as this video tonight. So if you have friends who couldn't make it, in a couple days we'll have this up on YouTube. And then lastly, word of mouth is so incredibly powerful and important. So if you like what you see and you already are a supporter of Greensboro Bound, please tell your friends, share the links, share our stories and our posts, and bring them into the fold, into the Greensboro Bound family. Second thing that you can do to help us is to actually make a donation to Greensboro Bound. You can do that right now by going to our website and clicking on the red heart in the center of the page that says donate. Or if you can't see that because you're on mobile, you can actually go right up to the menu bar and there's a little donate. Sorry about that. And you can click that button there and give us a gift of any size will help us to continue our mission and once again offer our free programming to educate, delight, and uplift readers of all ages. Thank you again to Gilda, ERIN, and Gary for joining us in this so important and timely conversation. Your expertise and knowledge is just astounding, but thank you so much for sharing all that you know with us. For our audience, please join us next Friday, September 25th at 7 p.m. for The Future of Democracy Part 2, Controlling the Vote, when we'll be talking with Nancy McLean, author of Democracy in Chains, and Jean Nickel, author of Indecent Assembly. Please visit our website, greensborobound.com, for our calendar of all of the rest of our events throughout the fall. Once again, thank you to Gilda, thank you to ERIN, thank you to Gary, and all of our audience. We really appreciate you being here with us tonight. Everybody stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.